since I came, for me, one of the things that I really enjoy to do are these book launches. It's a way to celebrate the hard work and the accomplishment of our faculty. During the pandemic, we were able to do it online on Zoom. We presented Susan's book. That was the last event that we had. But I am so happy that we're doing these events alive in person. And I'm also extremely happy to be presenting Carmen Martinez's book. It has been almost about 20 years of work that she has put in this volume. It's a very comprehensive ethnography of the indigenous movement in Ecuador in different regions of the country. So let me introduce the different speakers, and then I will move to another place. We're going to be playing musical chairs. So the first speaker will be Susan Paulson. She's professor of Latin American Studies, and she's an anthropologist here at the University of Florida. Her latest book is The Case for Degrowth. She's also the author of Masculinities and Femininities in Latin America's Uneven Development and Political Ecology Across the Spaces, Scales, and Social Groups. Then Professor Joanne Rappaport, who's an emeritus professor at Georgetown University, will be the second speaker. She's the author of Intercultural Utopias, The Disappearing Mestizo, Cowards Don't Make History, Orlando Fast Border, and the Origins of Participatory Action Research, which is her latest volume. The third speaker will be Professor Rudy Colloredo Mansfield. He's the Senior Associate Dean for Social Sciences and Global Programs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's a professor of anthropology. He has been doing field work in Ecuador for many, many years. Excellent work. He's the author of the Native Leisure Class, Fighting Like a Community. And his last book is Fast, Easy, and in Cash, Artisans' Hardship and Hope in the Global Economy. And the author of the volume is Carmen Martínez Novo. She's an anthropologist and professor of Latin American Studies here at the University of Florida. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Latin American Research Review, and she's the author of Who Defines Indigenous Identities, Development, Intellectuals, and the State in Northern Mexico. So I leave the floor to Susan.
Thank you, Carlos. Undoing Multiculturalism is a sophisticated, multi-sided ethnography that brings together a lot of really rich description, documentary evidence to understand political cultural dynamics and racial formations in Ecuador. When I read the book, it makes me rethink processes that are going on over larger scales and times also, driven to expand economies. Countries, governments across Latin America have long exploited and transformed territories managed by local communities and regenerated by them. In the late 20th century, this was intensified with mining, logging, industrial agriculture, and in Ecuador's case, especially petroleum exploitation that brought tremendous wealth to international investors and local elites, but also fueled national development and modernization. All around Latin America, indigenous communities resisted with their lives this kind of incursions into their territory and transformation. But at the same time, individual indigenous people were incorporated into the initiatives and benefited from them. So one of the things I've been really paying attention to as I read this book, every chapter shows these kind of insidious ways that individualism is being strengthened at great cost to movements and organizations, indigenous, Afro, or unions, and other ways of feeling connected with each other. One expression that Carmen describes is a shift in census categories, away from older categories that described identity in terms of languages, in shared cultures and territories, towards this new sort of self-identification in a body-based category of your race. Another example that Carmen described was the 2018 Constitution of Ecuador, which had anti-discrimination and affirmative action for opportunities for individuals to get ahead. Whereas the commons and communal management of territories remains sort of ambiguous and contradictory. Right? So there's this kind of process that I'm seeing all across the Americas in our state and country through there that I'm looking at. Okay, Carmen began to explore Ecuador in 1996 at the auge of indigenous movements. In 86, CONAI had formed this federated union of Amazonian, Andean, and coastal communities. In 88, intercultural bilingual education was institutionalized. In the 90s, there were several major marches that really managed to get policy changed. In 1998, an amazing constitution establishing pluriculture, multi-ethnic nation with collective rights. This book is published a quarter century later, and I'm afraid it like shows so much courage and I think pain, because for me, Carmen has taken on the bitter task of exploring what happened to those bright horizons. Why did they dim? How did those dreams and possibilities not become realized in the way that many of us imagined that they would? So first she analyzes the sort of end of the 20th century, a period that Charlie Hale characterized as neoliberal multiculturalism, where there was a push in many countries to support cultural identities and sort of glorify the products of culture, languages, folklore, diversity in that type of sense, but also advance policies that really undermined the material and substantive basis that allow the regeneration of shared identities. In the Ecuadorian context, Carmen actually finds a series of conditions in the middle of multicultural neoliberalism that allowed movements to thrive, to develop. They took advantage of certain aspects and started thriving. And she, at the same time, she's describing government after government, Noboa, Gutierrez, that act like quite purposely try to attack, to depoliticize, to discredit these movements. One of the things that happens is that the movements or actors in them become co-opted or available for cooptation by NGOs, by projects, by money, by visions for development. And she writes, as indigenous leaders become government officials and state technicians, Native intellectuals became tokens of neoliberal multiculturalism. They decreased pressure for structural change, became increasingly detached from their constituencies. Across Latin America, then, the turn of the century was characterized by extreme increases in economy and in distribution of resources. And in Ecuador, by a real decline in indigenous identification and movements. In fact, in the 2006 elections, the Pachacuti candidate got only 2% of the national vote. So Correa's campaign, that Carmen describes in great detail, says that he would redress this situation. It's like, dude, I'm going to link these two different strands: multicultural support for diverse ethnic worlds and revolutionary change away from exploitative political economies. I mean, personally, I love that. That's what I want for the entire world to happen. And I like that dream too. And I mean, it reminds me of Mariátegui, of the opera movement, and a whole century ago in Peru, people that were trying to link those kinds of visions. But unfortunately for me, I read on and Carmen records what actually happened. It's a kind of, crushing, right? Correa's administration promised synergy between these goals, but as time went on, it became antagonism, partly because Correa depicted himself as leader of this independence movement where Ecuador was going to free itself from US and World Bank domination. And the way to do it was to sell commodities, right? But to get to commodities, you had to invade indigenous territories. They were against it. So these guys were enemies of the revolution. They were enemies of our sovereignty and independence, right? I mean, at least this is my understanding of Carmen's explanation of it, which I find very compelling. And I also really, my eyes are opened by Carmen's detailed description of how the administration attacks colonial capitalism, which I also want to do, and also does what I do, which is continues to embody and enact practices, worldviews, relationships of colonial capitalism. Culture over nature dualism, hierarchical, racial, and gender systems. And in fact, she describes that even pushing those to the point of explicit attack and disdain of marginalized groups, which is a different, it's a difficult process. So I just like to end my observation by looking together at a few images. If our friend Krista can bring up, the first one we're going to see is a picture described by Carmen in the book. She's, okay, the next one. Oops, we're getting it. Okay, she describes the investiture of Correa, you see on the right-hand side there, in a rural territory. He's talking some Quechua, he's got his poncho on, and he's surrounded by other presidents. You can see him there with Evo and with Hugo. Exactly 10 years earlier, I show you a picture of Abdallah Bucaram, president of Ecuador, with Alberto Fujimori, president of Peru, doing drag of indigenous people at Sacsayhuaman, eating guinea pigs and choclo, right? And I threw in like a little photo of some local boys there so you could see. So I think this is some of the images that I'm thinking of when I read Carmen's theorization of ventriloquy and cross-dressing, which I think is really insightful. Let's look at the next image. For me, I think identity, it's not just a question of drag, of putting on a different outfit. I think most everyone in Ecuador would identify the feet on the left as what? Indigenous? Rudy's written about it, right? Working indigenous people. And the feet on the right, people in the city, those men are getting their shoes shined in their shiny Western shoes to make sure that they don't have contact with the soil, and they're different, right? It could be that the guy on the left and the right are identical twins raised in different contexts. But the point is, it's not that they can just switch. A farmer who has worn ujutus, raw sandals for 20 or 40 years, farming has hard calluses, and he can farm through the thorns, and he can walk and push the plow with his foot. But if he put on the shoes of the mestizo and walked around the city, he'd probably begin pinching and uncomfortable, right? And his cousin or identical twin, the same thing. If that guy took off his shiny Western shoes and tried to farm, his feet would hurt. They would get poked, they would bleed, they'd get blisters. Oops, are you still there? So it's much deeper. It's not a question of dressing as identity. It's becoming day by day through our interaction with the environment. And that's why, as Carmen describes, over and over, indigenous movements are about labor, land, and the education of regenerating the relation between those two, right? It's not only about the body, it's always about connection. Okay, got it. Let's see the next picture. And in many of these movements that she described, people deployed their body in their identifications, right? Here we have lowland indigenous marchers. In one of the marches, you can see they have painted their faces, they've got their spears, they've got woven bags, showing where they're from. There's bird feathers, showing their territory, showing their identification in that way. When they got up on the mountains, these people in the right joined them. Where are they from? Yeah, they're from the Andes, right? You can see from their bodies, from their way they walk, from their clothing. They're constructed in different ways, but Konai, what's magic about Konai is it allowed people sort of to think about themselves as related, even with these different constructions. Okay, let's see, I got a couple more pictures. This is a great occupation of a petroleum company where hundreds of indigenous people canoed in the middle of the night and took over and paralyzed the petroleum drilling well. One more. Okay, Carmen talks about another moment of Correa's of Correa's government, also in the first year, when he announced the first plan, the development plan in 2007, and they had this big sort of festival and had these folkloric dancers. This is a movement that really took off in the 90s under neoliberal multiculturalism, this kind of, you know, mestizo people from a mixed nation that sort of embraced and embodied these different traditions, Andean lowland traditions. What I really like about this book is Carmen's like, there's so many different ways to think about this. Michelle Begin, who is an anthropologist, she's also a musician that tours around with a folklore. I mean, she like went to Japan with an Andean folklore group wearing her poncho and playing the zampoña and stuff. She argues that these performances dignify indigeneity before urban and other people. Danielle Roper reads that they're fantasies of power that reenact the subjugation of colonized people. And Carmen proposes seeing them as a form of ventriloquy, where mestizos impersonate indigenous and Black populations, making a way for authorities to then speak for those figures through this kind of ventriloquy, right? So I think actually that all of these coexist. I mean, for me, it's not which is the right interpretation. They're all going on, and they interact in these dynamics that Carmen sees that have allowed regimes to associate indigeneity as a concept or an aesthetic or a product, a poncho or something, at the same time as they undermine the territorial and bodily realities of those people. Okay, one more slide. This is my question. Why don't we ask the same questions at the National Orchestra of Ecuador? Why don't I say, look, here's some people, they're mestizos of a mixed heritage nation, dressing up in drag as Europeans, being imposters and playing European language. What a bizarre thing. Isn't that just as much cross-dressing? And it really pushes me to think, I love when Carmen describes how the Quiteños are discussing like, oh, should we identify as mestizo or white in the census? Because it's for once pushing this discussion into white people, right? Is multiculturalism only about Indians? Like what, you know, what about Jewish people, mestizo, white people, Middle Easterners? They're sort of like absent from all this, right? So I love that she's pushing it in, and I'm also asking what's going on. Are these guys any less imposters or less cross-dressing than mixed mestizo heritage people that engage in indigenous? You know, there's different power relations that makes it really interesting. Okay, I think this is I think I have one more slide. Don't remember. Okay, no, go to the next one. Yes, I just want to end to mention this question of buen vivir. So before Correa, during Correa, after Correa, people all over Latin America were thinking with this idea, bem vivir, suma causa, and they were getting together in their communities, rethinking and discussing their own traditions of community well-being, of interrelated connections among humans and other beings, and thinking about how that worked. They were also using this idea to talk to environmentalists, to talk to post-development people, to human development people, and communicate across contexts. And I was actually at 2 different workshops where, you know, people were talking about this. Oh, this is so interesting. It's different from the capitalist getting ahead as an individual, because for me, well-being is all about my community well-being. And this is how it is in my community, and someone else. And in 2 different moments, someone from Ecuador says, you guys are fooled. Buen vivir is a top-down, asinine project imposed by authoritarian governments, and you've been duped. It's a failure. And I'm like, wow, it's so what's going on? And only when I read this book, I started to realize some of what was going on, right? That one thing is that some academics in Ecuador were really like reifying buen vivir, and Carmen cites them fighting about like, what's the correct word? Is it ayin kosai? And then what exactly was the date that buen vivir was invented? In which community? What the hell is that about? But there is this certain academic tradition of objective documentation or whatever that was maybe purposely or maybe not purposely just coincided with the opportunity for politicians to take advantage of this reified and now objectified thing and sell it or ventriloquize in their thing, right? Which makes it really different from many of the ways that Buen Beber is operating in other parts of Latin America and other communities, which I think is a real lesson for all of us, especially for me included, like how we, I mean, know what our job is, abstracting ideas and talking and writing about them, right? And so for me, it was a warning and also a possibility. So with those comments, I end my part.
Thank you, Susan. Joanne Rappaport, she's joining us from DC.
Buenas tardes. Hi. First of all, I want to thank Carmen for inviting me to participate in this book launch and for permitting me to address you virtually. I live with an 80-year-old and I didn't want to get on an airplane. But I'm really delighted, even if it's virtual, to celebrate the appearance between two covers of Undoing Multiculturalism. Carmen and I have shared many a conversation about her research. I read several of the articles that are precursors to the book. We applied for and were awarded ACLS fellowships at the same time to write our books. Initially, I thought I was turned down because they informed the associate professors first before they told the full professors. So Carmen got her news before me, but we both ended up having the year off at the same time. I also served as a not so anonymous reader for the University of Pittsburgh Press. So I've read this book several times. In short, I feel somewhat invested in this project and really enthusiastic about it coming out and circulating. I'm not going to, by the way, I'm not going to talk as long as Susan did, maybe because I'm doing it virtually, but anyhow. Carmen started the research that went into this book when she was at the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales, the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, Flaxo in Quito. So one might say she was an eyewitness, observer, perhaps participant to the processes she studies. They had a direct impact on her, on everything she was living at the time, of the people she was working with. This couldn't be distant observation. This was participation. Now, that positioning got more complex and more multi-sided over time as Carmen moved to Kentucky and ultimately to Florida. But I think that the beginnings of the project played a really significant role in determining how expansive her ethnography is and how much it's imbued with sentiments that come from living through the history she writes and participating in the history that she writes. Undoing Multiculturalism is essentially an examination of how a broad public has responded to Indigenous organizing in a particular context, marked by organized Indigenous opposition to resource extraction, led by a leftist government dependent on the production of oil, as Susan explained. As an aside, there's another book that has come out very recently that gives a similar story, that it would be beautiful if people had both of them together in a course, and that's Brett Gustafson's Bolivia in the Age of Gas, because the same issues are coming up in Bolivia, although the two scholars work from very different positionings and from very different experiences. Carmen, in Undoing Multiculturalism, explores a contentious relationship between CONAIE, the indigenous organization, and the Correa government, how it was expressed in public spectacle, how it was expressed in educational policy, as Susan mentioned, how it unfolded in the process of the census. But she also looks at other social actors, other social sectors, including the Catholic Church, and coming much closer to her own reality, decolonial scholars living in Ecuador, who claimed at different moments political positions that supported Correa's authority or supported the autonomy of the indigenous government. They're very ambiguous actors. Now, there are relatively few ethnographic studies of Latin American indigenous movements that effectively move between the national and the local levels. Ethnographers have left the task of studying these movements to sociologists and political scientists. I know there might be a few of you in the room who've largely concentrated on national leaderships, on constitutional reform, or on electoral behavior, leaving us with a really sparse handle on the ethnography of these movements and giving us no feeling of how these movements are lived by people at the community level. People who, in my experience, are willing to mobilize at a moment's notice, but they also pick and choose from the discourses and practices that their organizational leadership projects on the national scale. On the other hand, there are ethnographers who've done excellent work on the local level, but they rarely examine how local organizations articulate with these regional and national structures and with these regional and national discourses. Possibly because an understanding of the complexities of these movements requires a longer time commitment than most foreign scholars can dedicate to field research. This makes a strong case for the kind of rooted scholarship that Carmen demonstrates in this book. Now, as a result of the uneven nature of writings in English on Latin American indigenous movements, English-speaking readers have little understanding of the fact that political decision-making is not simply top-down, but takes on much more complex arrangements. While this is true across Latin America, and not only in countries in which leftist governments were elected, such as Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Argentina, Brazil, fissures between mestizo leftists and indigenous activists have emerged much more clearly in these places than in countries that continue to hew to neoliberal policies. It's hard to see it as clearly, for instance, in Colombia as it is to see it in Ecuador. In this sense, I think Carmen's argument and her ethnography are really crucial to an understanding of indigenous movements throughout the continent, because she moves deftly between levels. She juxtaposes and places in conversation the macro level of government and of movement politics with the micro level of communities, local educational administrators, indigenous intellectuals whose short biographies she provides, and the various interest groups cross-cut all of them. And finally, the meta level of academics who write about and advocate for various of these actors. I think she's doing something that very few other scholars have done. And I think that this makes Undoing Multiculturalism a must read for Latin Americanists and for activists who are concerned about Latin America. I congratulate her on this wonderful book. I have a copy of it, but I don't have it signed. So hopefully at some point she'll be able to write something inside the inside cover. Te felicito.
Thank you, Joanne. Rudy Colloredo.
Thanks. Thanks to Carmen Martinez for the invitation to be here, to the Center for hosting, to Joanne, to Susan, and to all of you for your presence. Boy, it is great that we're all in a room together. So I've organized my remarks around 4 questions, and one of them is for me, and 3 of them are for Dr. Martinez. And mine has been a long-standing one for me. The 3 that I have for Dr. Martinez are more along the lines of thought experiments, but I'll say they're not rhetorical. I actually want answers to these questions, although you can decide when you might want to answer them. Before I start all of my asking, I do want to say what a privilege it has been to be invited to engage this book so fully and responsibly. In intellectual terms, this book sets current literatures on extractivism, anti-racism, decolonial and post-development thinking into dialogue with social movement theory and agrarian transformation. So to all of you graduate students in the room, this is the book you need for your qualifying exams. This is going to do for you what Sherry Ortner's Theory and Anthropology since the 1960s did for me. It puts it all in one place, it puts it together, and you can kind of see how the picture works. It is, as Joanne mentioned, a vivid ethnography of a national extractivist civil society and the tensions that are within that society. And again, as both Susan and Joanne have mentioned, it's a real model of writing to coherently interrelate really such different levels of activity, lives, and ideas. And it's very well written. What I really like about it are the definitional commitments that Dr. Martinez makes in the beginning and then keeps returning to throughout, so you can see what is going on. I think that was super helpful for me as a reader, and it's a real model for writing. So I have lots more praise, but I'm going to leave that there, and I'm going to go to all the asking that I want to do. So my first question is, how consequential were Indigenous politics in the neoliberal multicultural era circa 2000? For anthropologists, for sociologists, political scientists, the 1990s were something, right? And I'm going to give you my timeline, which is 1990, the levantamiento, el sismo étnico in Ecuador, 1991, the Constitution in Colombia, 1992, the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Rigoberto Menchu, 1994, the Zapatista uprising, 1996, the Pachakutik election, and 1998, the Ecuadorian Constitution. This really changed the possibilities for Indigenous people and changed the possibility for what anthropology is meant to engage. At least that is how it felt to me as a newly arriving anthropologist at that time. What then, and I blame Charlie Hale, what then comes out then are actually two possibilities of what this moment meant. And I'm going to talk about one as strong multicultural and the other is co-opted multicultural. So strong multicultural is the sense that what is happening is now a substantive political force against neoliberalism and particularly and effectively against privatization. Right, and that's a structural presence of the Indigenous movement. At the same time, there is this question of the devolution of power to communities, but not as withdrawal, but as a new way for communities not just to manage their own affairs, but to make the state accountable to the community. And there is also the cultural agenda. And then I think, and because I had a colleague at the time, I was teaching at Iowa, Nora England, a linguist who worked with a lot of Maya linguists, brought to my attention the importance of that cultural and language activism in a post-conflict society that was paralyzed. So all of this felt substantive and structural. Charlie begged to differ. Professor Hale then steps up and points out at how this multicultural recognition, the way it is becoming institutionalized is, and Dr. Martinez does a good job with this in the book, it returns to this point several times, neoliberal multiculturalism brought limited cultural recognition, and when it did not bring the resources for that recognition to matter. And Victor Breton, then looking at NGOs, shows that the performance of indigeneity for NGOs also was inconsequential materially, but now there is a bigger price to be paid because we are culturally dismembering a rural and working class that should be playing for much higher stakes. So that's the co-opted multiculturalism. So now we get to undoing multiculturalism and we can go after the answer. Which was it, the strong or the co-opted? And this is a little like when you read Darwin, The Origin of Species, and he describes some new species, the mannerisms, and then he'll describe their appearance. And the next thing you know, he's describing the contents of its stomach. And this goes on several times in the origin of species. So first, if you're an animal, you want to stay the hell away from that English stout fellow. And second of all, it's really revealing to know what these animals ate. It's really revealing to know the contents of the stomach, to understand the ecology of these species. So this gets me to this question. Now that we feel like it has passed, right, in the face of the violent attacks on the indigenous movement in the communities, on the face of the insults of its leaders, on the face of taking apart this movement, in the remains can we see its strength, in the remains can we see what it is, what it was. And I will say that just that in itself shows how much was accomplished, right? Because undoing multiculturalism shows a leadership that is no longer effective and disconnected from the base. And with Luis Alberto Toaz's analysis, shows communities exhausted in the movement, shows the movement pretty much played out. And yet it took an extraordinary amount to remove it as an obstacle to the extractivist agenda. And so there is a politics available in rural Ecuador and in between communities and provincial governments that is strong enough that it needs a concerted attack by the central government to undo it. And I think that that's testimony to the strength of what still remained, even when it seemed like it was played out. But the strength of this book is it's actually building two theoretical vantage points to go after this question in other ways. And one of them is the racial formations, right? The work of racial formations in this book is very helpful because of the way, and this is where Dr. Martinez is working from Omi Winat's idea that the racial formation is a social historical process by which racial categories are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. And one of the ways that Dr. Martinez works with this idea is to, again, move people away from the idea that race and racism has to be a place of personal enmity or personal hatred. But in fact, race and racism is playing out precisely in that moment when someone is stepping in to help another race, and in doing that, elevating themselves and subordinating that group. And that gets into the argument about ventriloquism. And that shows the importance of voice, of representation. And the book pursues that in multiple ways. Voice and representation around statistics, voice and representation around how one measures poverty. And so in that, I think, again, we're revealing actually the weakness of the accomplishment of the indigenous movement, because where voice was achieved, the stakes were always so low. And when the stakes were high for indigenous people and they had their voice at the same time, it was exhausting. You had to mobilize the entire world and shut down the country, and then your voice could be heard, but you could never just walk in the room and have your voice heard. And so, again, the racial formations vantage point, I think, is a very powerful one for showing, again, the weaknesses. So then the other side of this, the other thing that is built in this book that for me was new was, again, what Joanne and Susan have been pointing to, the ethnography that is at work. And for a while, as I was reading, I was thinking, well, here's an ethnography of a national community of indigenous people, of activists, of NGOs, of academics. The more I read, the more I didn't like that idea. I felt like it was not really a community. It was a network in which people came together, and in coming together recognized each other in that network, but they did not actually hang together that often. There are nodes, there are Salesian missionaries, there's Flaxo, there are government offices, there's a bureaucracy of education. There are nodes and people are arriving. They know what the project is, they know who they are, but mostly they're not together in that moment. But it is still an ethnographic account of that world. And so I found that to be very helpful, and also then a sign of the strength of the movement and what it accomplished, because it's such an interesting group of people who are present in all of those nodes, and they are still here, and some of them are in this room right now. I mean, this is going on. But what is striking to me is the absence of a commercial node. It's the absence of that durable economic place of agency in these nodes that is, again, part of the weakness. So you see what I'm doing. I'm going, it's strong, it's weak, it's strong, it's weak. And so I'm not really answering my own question. So now I'll go on to all of Carmen's questions. So here's the first question. What concept would you like to see debated by two groups? One are the Salesian missionaries, the indigenous catechists on the one hand, and on the other hand, rural sociologists, anthropologists, and political scientists. I really came to respect and be very interested in the analysis of religiously trained thinkers in this book. And we've talked about how I love Father Manangon's comment, the community is the pebble in the shoe of capitalist development, right? So I thought that was great. I wrote this book, Fighting Like a Community. I thought, oh, man, this guy's my brother. And then I think, what do you do when you have a stone in your shoe? You just throw it out, you pick it up, you tip it out, and then you feel even better than before. And that's why I like this statement even more, because it gets at both of the realities of the community. But I came to be so interested, and they've taken so many different paths, and yet there is a religious grounding to their thinking that is not just a kind of way to approach a text, but it is also a presence in their activism and a sense of sacrifice that is within that I think informs what they do. But that's a real question. What would you do? What concept would you give them to debate? So that's question number one. So question number two, based on the experience you had in your research, this is what I think of as my question about intercultural method. Based on the experience that you had in your research, what approach to interviewing, observing, and writing would you have us go out and test, right? So it's not like I'm saying you have figured it out, right? You have the method that we all need. I'm sure this is such an interesting book, and you operated at so many different levels. You must have at some point been doing something and you thought, wow, this is really interesting. So what was that moment? And tell us to go do it, and we'll see if we think this is an interesting thing to do. And I think this is an intercultural kind of move that you're making in this book. And I'm not going to go into this in detail because I see this in relation to something like Linda Tuiwai Smith's decolonizing methodologies. That's not actually what I think this is that you're doing in this book, but it is akin to that and actually could come into that space. But basically what you did a lot in here. You did some interesting things. What do you want us to go do? That's my question. And so here's the third question. So, okay, it's 1976. It's 1976 and you're in the Department of Anthropology at Católica. And you have three choices, right? You can be, and these are the choices you gave to yourself in this time travel. You have three choices, right? For your line of research, there's leftist politics and agrarian reform, right? And then there is popular Catholicism, and then there is ethnohistory. You're and Solomon. You have to be one of these. What are you? Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
We'll continue with the musical chairs. Carmen? Thank you, Rudy. Carmen?
Okay, well, thank you. What? Oh, yeah, me voy a quitar la máscara. So, yeah, thank you very much, Susan, Joanne, Rudy, for your kind words and challenging words, and everyone else also for being here, sharing with us this beautiful evening of a Thursday. And I had something prepared, like to just kind of a biographical thing, but I don't know how to go along. If first answer Rudy's questions and then go to my theme, because in my writing I was kind of looking at kind of how I started and what I think are some contributions of the book. So I will do that maybe later for the sake of conversation, and take Rudy's challenge, which is I will keep thinking about it. I don't know if I can answer now, but I like the term religiously trained thinkers, and why I became interested in them. Well, the interesting thing is I didn't grow up in a religious family, so I'm non-religious. So maybe that's one thing that attracted me to the religious people there, because they seem exotic to me or different, or people kind of that I hadn't known before. So that must be one reason. But the other is like, relates to Joanne's presentation. When you go up to places like Zumbagua, 4,000 meters above sea level, very cold, it was not poorly communicated when I first went in 2002. Now it's a totally different place, much more cosmopolitan because of Correa having a special investment in it. But you realize that anthropologists, social scientists, they have been there, like Mary Westmantle had written a book about Zumbagua, Jose Sanchez Parga, different people have been there, but kind of not that for that long. Like they would be there for maybe a year, a few months, or go there and come back. But it was very different from the religiously minded thinkers, because these people had a commitment that was amazing. I mean, Father Manangon had been there for 30 years and some other people there. So really, like, the commitment of the people was something that really moved me. And I had to kind of try to reflect that in my writing. I remember Father Manangon telling me when I first went up to Zumbagua, he said, well, Carmen, you're here to judge us. And he was very generous to give me access to everything, which didn't happen in other cases. Not all the Salesians are very transparent. Like in the Amazon, they were not that generous and didn't let me kind of study them. So it varies, it's very diverse. Not everybody is the same. But in his case, he said, well, you're here to judge us. And I said, how can I come here for 3 weeks to judge your work of 30 years? So it's like, so really, I think there is something about permanence and commitment that they have that is very important. And this is something that I kind of point out in my work, that we academic, maybe many like me who are not religious or not in very good relations with the church, many people have actually ignored the work of these people. They don't really want to look at it, they don't want to talk to them, or they assume that they are just kind of colonizing people, which it also happened, by the way. That's part of the story. And part of the story, for instance, in the Amazon is the Salesians colonizing the Shuar and quote unquote pacifying them since the end of the 19th century until the 1970s, and then deciding to liberate the Shuar and recover their culture. And the whole confusion that was created in that moment of, like, for the indigenous themselves, that's something that I also reflecting about in the book. It's like some people say, well, but they told us to forget about our culture, learn Spanish. They said that there was only one God, which is the real God, and our God, Arutam, was the devil. So we rejected Arutam, and now they tell us to recover Arutam and go back. So they were totally confused, like a kind of challenging but the missionaries kind of were aware of these contradictions also, and of the contradictions with their own history. So I think that's kind of, and I actually have worked with them, like the Salesians have invited me. I participated in a book that they did about the history of the Salesian order in Ecuador, with chapters by different people, and they were especially interested in people like me who worked for them, outsiders. We were not part of their order, or kind of lay missionaries or something like that. So they invited us, and the thing that is very interesting, because they are liberation theology minded people, it's like they are very much into a kind of self-criticism, and I mean, they would publish critical things from people, but that are also respectful. Well, these people that I'm talking about, like Father Manangon or Father Gigi or some others, Father Botasso, they are people who were pioneers. I mean, some of them were in Barbados and were amongst the first people to claim indigenous rights in the early 1970s. So it's like people who made history in some ways, and they have many limitations too, like in many ways, because, and I try to also reflect those nuances in that chapter, because there is only like a certain point to which they can go, like, because they will work with the state, they will work with the hierarchies. The church also has its own hierarchies, and there is also kind of a conversation between the high hierarchies of the church and the people on the ground that become more radicalized. So there are many nuances in terms of gender, like they couldn't work on birth reproductive rights or anything like that. So they have many, many limitations, but on the other hand, they are very interesting as colleagues. Many of them are anthropologists. So one of the things I discovered looking at doing the study up technique, like the idea of not only studying the indigenous, but also studying the researchers and the state and the NGOs and so on, is that what was I got lost here, my track of thought, but oh, the study app, yeah, but I forgot what I was going to say about the missionaries. But oh yeah, is that a lot of the anthropologists were actually also religious people. Like there is no difference between three actors that I thought were different at the beginning. The left, the state, the anthropologists, and the priests, but they are kind of the same. Like some of the anthropologists were part of the leftist political parties, some of the anthropologists were priests. So it's kind of very blurred, all the boundaries. And that's what you see when you do ethnography, and you not only you don't have like blinders, you don't pay attention to only like looking below, but you look everywhere. And I like your concept of ethnography of a national community, because yeah, that's what was intended there, but with a focus on racial formations and indigeneity and the indigenous movement. The second thing, the methodology. Yeah, I think that my methodology, I was calling it in this book, and my book in Mexico has a similar methodology. I got inspiration in the idea of a study app of Laura Nader. It's something that has been kind of claimed since the 1970s, but not many people have done. And more people are doing it now, by the way. There is like a new wave of ethnographies on whiteness and elites in Latin America that are coming out. Maybe in the context now of the turn towards the right or racist backlash and things like that, people are becoming more interested in looking at the elites and looking at what it means to be white in Latin America. So the study app, but I think that came from, it's not just a study app, it came from the idea of political economy. That is also a 70s idea of Eric Wolf and many others in anthropology, that is, you cannot study people in isolation because they are not isolated. So you have to study people in interaction with other people. And you just go to the field, and this is the people who are there, the missionaries, the anthropologists, the ethnolinguists, the state. They are all there doing things, being connected in community or not, or but we are trained not to see a lot of what goes on. That's the interesting thing. Like, it's not what we see, but what we don't want to see, or what we see and don't write about. So, because we see it, but then we don't write about it because we think we are not supposed to write about it. But why are we not supposed to write about it? Because it's not easy. And I teach a class here that is called Latin American Elites, and also an anthropology of the state. And it's very hard to do this kind of work. And it's hard to do a little bit, but it's harder to write about it and to publish it, because these people are the ones who are the gatekeepers, who are going to read you. And I mean, you get in trouble, basically. Like, friends that I have that have done a study app have had to move from one fieldwork location to another. And I did that in my book in Mexico, and the book is not translated to Spanish. And 10 years, I also was working on academics and NGOs, the state in Mexico. And 10 years after the book was published, I asked the director of an university in the Mexican border, so 10 years have passed, and we now translate the book into Spanish? And he said, well, it's still very delicate. So it's like 10 years after, like, or maybe more. So yeah, it's difficult. Like, you burn bridges, you expose yourself, you make enemies sometimes, because if you want to say like what really goes on, which I do, and I don't know why I do, I'm a little bit suicidal, but so I tell the students that in that class, like, okay, this is very interesting to do, it's fascinating, but you're gonna get into trouble, because this is the very people who are going to publish you or not publish you, or things like that. So it's very, particularly academics, is hard to think about. Like, some academics have told me, there are so many interesting things to study. Why are you writing about colleagues? But the people who write about the study app, they always comment on that, because they say, like, our social sciences are training us to look down, to look towards the subaltern or marginalized, and everything you try to look somewhere else, they will tell you, no, look, what about the people? Look down, and you're gonna be told to do that once and once again. And then there are other things there, like some people, I mean, for a study app, in my case, it's about positionality. I'm from Spain originally. I've had access to different social kind of groups in Ecuador and in Mexico too. And maybe it's not possible for everyone in the same way. So it's like not everyone can do this kind of work. Because Spaniard is a very interesting position, like metropolitan position here, because you are an insider, like people recognize you as part of the society, but you're also an outsider at the same time, because you're a foreigner, but you speak fluently and you will be recognized as part of, I mean, we have like a position there, maybe colonial or something. So people will talk to you and you will get a lot of the comments that are interesting about paternalism. And that's why you get to some things that, one of the things that I want to focus on is the question of paternalism or soft racism, which not many people, there are some writings here and there, but there is not a lot on that. And I think it's so important to understand inequalities in Latin America. And it links very clearly with colonial histories. So racism, open racism is there, but there is a more subtle phenomenon that needs to be studied, that it's very difficult to pinpoint, that when you pinpoint it, you're gonna be in trouble too, because they are going to tell you that these people are advocates, they are doing good. So that's another problem there. Like, and they really think of themselves as doing good. So it's not, you have to show the nuances there too. So it's difficult to do, but I think there is worth doing it because of the information that you can get. And I can say that in my book in Mexico and this book, some of the people who really enjoyed some of my presentations were the indigenous people in Mexico. And I have to see more when I translate this. I'm translating it into Spanish too. But because they were laughing at, like, looking at these other characters. And it's also liberating not to be like the observed, but kind of somebody else is the observed that you know, and it was fun for some people to think of that. What are the decolonizing? So I think there is real value on studying up and studying power, but there is real difficulty because power is power. But we can talk more about that. Regarding the 1970s, I have a chapter which is kind of a history of anthropology. Well, it's not only anthropology, ethnohistory, anthropology, ethnolinguistics in Ecuador, where I look at the kind of my colleagues and the different, and I look at culture there as intellectuals, as not just kind of individuals in a vacuum, but as people who are positioned in a particular institution, in a particular moment, that have to kind of solve problems in a particular conjuncture. So one of the conjunctures is what Rudi was explaining here. In the 1970s, in the times of agrarian reform, and when democracy came for the first time in Ecuador in 1970, in a long time, in 1979, anthropologists were very, very active there politically. It's one of the things that I like about studying Ecuadorian anthropology. It's very engaged, it's very political. And more interestingly, the Department of Anthropology was created because they needed to understand what was going on with the peasantry and what should be done. So they didn't create anthropology. I mean, some of the people talking about the anthropologists of the South, like I'm thinking of Lins Ribeiro and some other colleagues, they think of it as kind of being a colonial import from anthropologists like North American or European anthropologists, and they go there and then people import these ideas. And in part that happened, like people like Jean Collier, or I don't know, they went to Ecuador, and then people, they had assistants, and the assistants became anthropologists. They came here with a grant and so on. So there is that. But on the other hand, there was like a need. And according to Francisco Ron, who created one of the most radical NGOs in Ecuador that publishes the journal Ecuador Debate, it was also like the need to create an anthropology department was to also move beyond the very abstract discussions of Marxism, where they were like reading Capital and looking at quoting page 175 of volume 2 of Capital and this and that. And they decided, no, we have to do ethnography. We have to go to the field. And that was very important. And they went with groups of students. So the history is really, really interesting. And there was like a real engagement, as also like Joanne has said for the in her new book on engaged kind of anthropology. Like it's very interesting to look at Latin American anthropologists. And as I said, it's not separated from society because it's also. So the question, what am I? Leftist politics, studying the agrarian reform, popular Catholicism, or ethnohistory. What a difficult choice. I think maybe the ethnohistorians were very interesting. Popular Catholicism was fascinating. I think I would have been in the more boring agrarian reform people. But those were, when you read it, like reading these 1970s writings about the agrarian reform, sometimes it's hard, because they were very abstract and dry, and probably I would be among the dry, abstracts and boring people, but not because I think it's the most valuable approach necessarily. But interesting, they had very interesting disagreements there, because the popular Catholicism thought that these Catholic festivals were a way to keep indigenous culture alive and fight capitalism, while the Marxists thought that the popular kind of celebrations were a way of the mestizos exploiting indigenous people, because they were renting them the costumes and the church and the main square and charging them so much that people became indebted and had to sell their lands to the mestizos. So there was a debate there, but I think both sides were very interesting to look at. So, I think in general, I won't go to my more formal notes, but I would say that it's kind of another look at the Latin American societies, and particularly Ecuador. And I invite everyone to read the book if you can, or wish. Thank you very much, everyone.
I don't know if we have questions from the audience, or if the participants want to raise another point before we close this. Yeah.
Can I say something answering the last of Rudy's questions? That in the mid-1970s, an engaged Latin American social scientist would have probably done all three at once. At least that's what Orlando Falsborda did.
That's a good.
Thank you, Joanne. Catherine, can you repeat your question, please?
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, for how many years she has been working on this book? Sorry to repeat, I feel intentional.
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's interesting how it developed, but when I arrived in Ecuador, I was still working on my book on Mexico, so trying to finish that. But so the fieldwork that the book is based on started in 2002 when I first went to Sumbawa. And Sumbawa, I went there because it was kind of, I was sent there by my friend Francisco Ron, who led the radical NGO, and he said, I asked, where should I go to study indigenous and the interaction with allies? And he said Sumbawa, because there were liberation theology, a little bit of everything. And later the whole Correa movement also became part of, because Correa had been a missionary in Sumbawa, which I did, that was unexpected. But yeah, it was many years, but I was getting like articles written about this and different chapters and articles. And it's weird, like the life of a book. In a way, I would say, like intentionally writing the book like maybe 2-3 years, but like the material in which the book is based, because there were kind of articles that came out of it and different experiences and so on, it was much longer. So I even don't know the answer, because sometimes I say, like, was I writing this book only for 3 years, or was I writing this book since 2002 when I started going to Zimbabwe? That's kind of a good question, but finally I decided to say, like, maybe I was only writing the book in the last 3 years. But one of the things I did that I see other people, I didn't get to talk about it, and it was in my formal comments, is also try to overcome, which is another very difficult thing, try to overcome the separation between Andean and Amazonian work, because the book is both about the Andes and the Amazon, because I was thinking about racial formations, indigeneity, indigenous politics, the state, the allies, and they kind of all interconnected. Like the Salesians were first in the Amazon, and then they moved to Zimbabwe, and the experience in the Amazon has an effect on what they did in Zimbabwe. The indigenous people, they know each other. They work between Amazonians and Andeans. They work together, and they have their differences, make their jokes about themselves, the different sections, but they work together, maybe in tense ways, but they do. And they also, the anthropology is a little bit different, because they were very much centered in Quito for a long time. And in Ecuador, the work in the Amazon comes later. It was dominated by foreigners until the 70s, until oil and the state arrived in the Amazon, and that's when it becomes. But one of the things I wanted to do is overcome the difference, and this is very difficult because, as I said, many people have said that John Murray, to begin with, Franz Salomon, Rudi is doing that in the present, and other people, Blanca Muratorio, many other people, but still the academic communities of Andeans and Amazonists are very separated, and they don't talk to each other very often. They don't read each other, and it's even kind of, people try to place you and they say, "But are you Andeanist or Amazonist?" And they have to place you in one, because it's very uncomfortable to be. And there is also kind of a difference in the, Blanca Muratorio always pointed this out. The Andeanists tend to be more like the agrarian reform, Marxists, this and that. And the Amazonists sometimes were more kind of into other issues, more of identity and environment. And so there were different questions that now can overlap more, but I tried to overcome that, but that was also a difficult one. I hope I could answer. Go ahead.
I would like to know how you address the difference that we can see clearly in this movement and the president, and how the indigenous movement has inside it. I would like to ask as well, how do you address the need of development that we still have, of course, this version nature that goes against what is written, God is right, and how is from other governments beforehand, and how is different from the governments now?
Well, that's a great questions, Diego. The indigenous movement. So, yeah, well, what I think to first begin with, I think one limitation of the book that I say in the introduction is that a book about multiculturalism should have ideally included the Afro-Ecuadorian movement, but it didn't. And the reason I didn't is because I think, I mean, because I was into like having this very deep engagement and detail, I don't think I can fairly talk about something that I didn't get to study that deeply. So I think and I remember a critique of Jean Rayer when he says that a lot of people talks about indigenous and Afro-Ecuadorians, and some very often Afro-Ecuadorian is an afterthought. Like they just put the name there, but they don't really study or understand or know it. So as out of respect, but I think that would be maybe a project that to be undertaken. Regarding the indigenous movement, and so I'm looking, it's very complex, and how they interact with different governments is different, and sometimes it's similar, because one thing that I found, I don't talk too much about the current situation because I have not been in Ecuador more recently. Well, I have been, but only briefly. But I look at different governments like Lucio Gutierrez, Abdallah, because I was in Ecuador during those periods, and then compared to Correa. And actually some of the strategies were similar. In that, for instance, Abdallah tried to co-opt some leaders and make them ministers to co-opt the movement. He tried to divide the indigenous movement. He tried to co-opt smaller organizations, for instance, the Protestant indigenous groups, because indigenous movement, well, that's one of the things we look at, and this is a tension that actually Kleber has pointed out to me, and it's something to think about. But we anthropologists tend to talk about the indigenous movement, but it's so much more diverse. Like to begin with, there is Conalle, but there is also evangelical indigenous. Conalle is made up of different groups, so it's very complex. Yeah, so that's another thing. I mean, there are smaller organizations. There is a socialist organization, Fenocin, that was very active under the agrarian reform. There is the evangelical indigenous. There is the communists, Federación Ecuatoriana de Indios, who came from the Communist Party, but then almost disappeared under the agrarian reform. So something that some presidents have done when in power is to try to empower the smaller organizations to weaken Conalle. And Conalle is very much linked to the Catholic Church. Conalle has Catholic origins in different, at least in the areas where I have studied, and that's one of the contributions also of my work. But in the case of the Shuar, in the case of Cotopaxi, in the case of Chimborazo, you see the Catholic Church very clearly. They are linked to Conalle. Also the left, but Catholic is the main thing. So okay, so there is all this complexity. Other strategies, like other strategy, for instance, that Correa used and other presidents used before, is to try to bypass the organizations and talk directly to the communities. So there is like a resemblance on what other presidents did and Correa did, but how was Correa different? Your last question, which is very, very good. Well, and I will go to the other question later, but it was different because Correa had a lot more money. I mean, it was the time of the oil boom, and there was so much money in Ecuador that there had never been in the history of Ecuador. So there was like a whole boom of state formation. Correa tried to reach every corner of the country, had much more territorial engagement than previous governments. So if Abdallah or Lucio tried to kind of divide and fragment, but Correa was much more powerful because of this, a lot of money and apparatus, like much stronger, bigger apparatus of the state that he had. And also, yeah, the question that Correa was of the left, one of the things that I look at that is very complex is how, well, some of the people working with Correa were leftist activists, and some of them had been Pachacutis cadres. They had been mestizos that had created the Pachacutic political party that is kind of somehow associated to the indigenous movement. So these people really knew very well the social movements. So Correa, being a leftist, created a lot of confusion. Like people thought he would be with them. At the same time, these people who were insiders knew the movements very well. I think they were much more effective sometimes in dismantling and fragmenting the movements because they knew them so well. And there is a whole bunch of people who were Pachacuti who became Correas. Particularly, there is Doris Solis, who was a Pachacuti who became Minister of Peoples and also Minister of Politics or Government or something like that. But she did a lot of very specific work, sometimes with our own students from FLAG, so people we had trained. And a lot of information we got was also because the students would come to us and talk to us and say, like, I'm working for the government. And one of my chapters for the other book was called I am against the government even though I'm the government. So there was a lot of that, people working for the government who were against the government or were critical and talking about that. So there was a lot of disorientation. In chapter, I think it's chapter 3, I tried to document that people were confused because sometimes they were being co-opted. Sometimes another strategy of Correa was co-opting the middle leaderships and leaving out the higher leadership. Sometimes there were other strategies that were economic, that are very interesting, and that appear in another chapter, in the chapter on the anthropologist. For instance, attacking the international cooperation. International cooperation financed the indigenous movement, but Correa centralized that and didn't allow international cooperation to work independently. So it defunded the indigenous movement. That was one of the strategies that was pursued. The other strategy that is economic is with education. The indigenous movement used to hire the teachers and the administrators of intercultural bilingual education, but Correa centralized that into the Ministry of Education. So that meant, and that's the main, that was very important because if you're indigenous and you're educated, one of the few jobs you can do in Ecuador is be a teacher, rural teacher. And if Correa controlled the jobs and not the indigenous movement, I mean, it was so smart. It was a whole multi-faceted strategy that attacked the allies, even the church. Like we know of a student, and this is not in the book, but who had kind of lists of people who were troublesome to the government, secret lists. And among them were the priests too, in their names were also there, like Banangon and people like that. So anyways, so how was different? Correa was much more efficient than other governments, although he followed similar strategies. And then the whole thing at the same time, with all these discourses of rise of nature, summa causae, good living, all these things, he confused people also, allies, people outside of Ecuador. Everybody was kind of, confusion is something that I think is something that I try to study there. But so that's one thing, but there are many other details there. How, the development. Well, one thing that I don't accept of Correa is like he was, and they use, and some allies, some social scientists use the idea that, okay, Correa had to repress the indigenous movement because development was necessary for Ecuador. As he said, we cannot be beggars sitting on a bag of gold, which meant oil. So that's what he said. And so many people justify this, and this is not particular to Ecuador. That happened in Venezuela, also in Bolivia, that indigenous people suffered because of, supposedly they were minor compared to the needs for development and overcoming poverty of the country. But this creates a first problem: who is the country? So then if the indigenous have to be sacrificed for the good of the country, that means they are not the country, or they are not important to the country. And that was very clear in the discourse of Correa. He said, why should 13 million Ecuadorians suffer for a bunch of stone throwers, as he called the indigenous leaders, or Conalle? So the 13 million Ecuadorians were the mestizos, because, or maybe, I mean, that was ambiguous, because another strategy that he followed, that's the only place I engage other social movements, is the division between, I think Correa worked very hard on dividing the indigenous movement from the Afro-Ecuadorian movement and also from the Montubios. And yeah, and I explained that. That's difficult to say also, but I try to make a nuanced explanation that, but the whole thing was division. And but the idea of poverty versus no, because yeah, it's an argument that authors like Catherine Walsh have used and many others, or even talking about Bolivia, we have to prioritize overcoming poverty versus kind of indigenous rights. But if you see what happened with the money, I mean, that's something I don't get into in the book. And that's another maybe like a shortcoming that in an ideal world I would have liked to have done. And that money disappeared. It didn't go. I mean, Ecuador was left with no money after having had huge amount of money, although there was money spent in some projects, but most of them were not sustainable. There were overprices. Millions and millions and millions of dollars are not accounted for. The corruption was fantastic. So where is the overcoming poverty versus indigenous rights? Is more a discourse than really a reality, because where is Ecuador now after having had all that money? Yes, they invested, but the investment were so fragile. The schools of the millennium are falling down, are not sustainable because the kids, the community schools were closed and the kids were to the schools of the millennium, but they couldn't travel, so people migrated and the schools are just falling down. They didn't have money for maintenance. The roads are falling down, many of them that were built in that time. Huge universities that were built are not sustainable. So everything was like a big dream. And yes, there was investment. And this is not so much in the book, but one of the things that was done is there was co-optation on a big scale. And studying up allowed me to see that co-optation not only happened with indigenous, but it happened at all levels. Like the upper class was co-opted. They were not leftists, but they became Correa supporters because they made a lot of money. And according to Alberto Acosta, many other people, like the rich people of Ecuador made lots of money state projects and so on. The middle class, they got, well, a lot of people going scholarships to go to study to Harvard were the oligarchies of the country, because the government was giving grants to go to study in the United States, but people had to be accepted to a university before getting the grants. Who was going to be accepted to Harvard? The children of the oligarchy. So these people got grants paid for by the sacrifice of indigenous people and nature. And the middle class, they all had grants, consultancies. So it was at all levels, the universe. And it was kind of, yes, there was redistribution in that sense. I mean, the money not all got lost. So a lot of it was redistributed, but I don't see the question of we needed to sacrifice indigenous and nature to overcome poverty, because we didn't overcome poverty, but we did sacrifice indigenous and nature at the end. So.
I think it's time to close this. Thanks so much to Carmen. Thanks so much to the different speakers of today's event. Thank you for coming here. I don't know what else to say. Congratulations to Carmen. Let's give her a big applause.
One last thing to say, sorry, that I have flyers. If you want, if you are interested in the book, you get a 30% discount. I think there are some flyers there, or I have some additional in case people are interested in getting the book. Thank you guys.